Well, seeing a quorum, I'd like to welcome everyone to our Aero Insights webinar today to talk about our new study on digital thread in collaboration with EY. I'm Katie Summerlin Barron. I'm AIA's Senior Director of Policy Communications, and I have a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded. All participants will be muted, but please feel free to put your questions in the chat. And we'll take as many as we have time for at the end. We do have time set aside for Q&A, and the recording will be available on AIA's website, probably by the end of today. And there will be a link to the study in the chat shortly, so please feel free to click on that. And I'll start by briefly introducing our three panelists. So Raman Ram is the America's Aerospace, Defense, and Mobility Leader at EY, where he focuses on helping clients address complex strategic and operational challenges. With more than 2 decades of experience in aerospace, industrials, and aviation, Raman works closely with leading organizations across the aerospace and defense sector, bringing deep expertise in cost transformation, digital enablement, supply chain optimization, and new business model innovation. Tim White is Vice President of Engineering and Technology at the Aerospace Industries Association, where he advocates for the technical workforce to policymakers. In this role, he leads AIA staff and association members in identifying, developing, and executing consensus programs and activities aimed at enhancing cost savings, performance, and efficiency within the aerospace and defense industry. And we also have today Dr. Colleen Reike, who is a senior manager in EY's technology and consulting AI and data practice, where she leads critical initiatives at the intersection of AI, data, and emerging technologies. She led EY's Digital Thread Research Initiative in collaboration with AIA, working closely with her team to bring together cross-industry perspectives, analysis, and insights that underpin today's discussion. So I'll kick it over to Tim real quick, and I'll go ahead, quick disclaimer, and I'll kick it over to Tim to start us off.
That's fantastic, Katie. So grateful for that introduction and grateful to have not just the EY team here, but many of the people who helped shape and drive the outcomes of this study. So to provide a little framing, AIA's objective is to really be the voice of the industry on the most salient topics that are impacting the aerospace and defense industry. We as an industry have always had shared priorities around quality and safety and value to the customer. And at the same time, we also recognize that there is a need for speed. As we think about speed, it isn't just how quickly can you build the items, it's also how quickly can you develop and engineer the items, and how quickly can you support and provides after-sales support to everything that is out there in the field. In this environment where we've got so many mandates, the question at hand is, how do we deliver? And we came up with a hypothesis sometime last year, and we thought that given the fact that there is so much data in our ecosystem and in our industry, understanding how that data is related together and how we can better utilize and leverage that data to increase velocity while maintaining our shared priorities would be an interesting topic to explore. In our industry, we call that the digital thread. And so we got engaged with our friends over at EY to explore that hypothesis, and they've just done a fantastic job of exploring, talking to people, understanding what the opportunities, challenges, and really the next steps will be for the digital thread. So I am so excited to hear what they have to say. I love the report that they've put out. I think it's going to be impactful for everybody. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to my friend Raman Ram to give a little bit more feedback on where we've been and where we're headed.
Thank you much, Tim. Thanks, Katie, and thanks to Dr. Tim White and AIA for giving EY the opportunity to collaborate and develop a perspective on this important topic. You know, digital thread, the concept has been around for a while. At least for a couple of decades, industry has talked about it. And so why are we excited about it, now? I think I've at least three things I wanted to highlight as to why, it is more important now than ever. Um, First one is, the data collection, management, data governance, and the digital enablement around it to generate value out of it. All the capabilities have advanced quite a bit now, more so in the past 5 years than in the past. So we've got the capability more now, than was possible earlier to extract value out of it. Number two is the A&D sector is in a secular uptick, at least for the next decade. We can see that there's unprecedented backlogs in the commercial side. There is a ramp up, particularly on the munitions, on the missiles, on the defense side. So demand is not an issue. We are, like Dr. White just mentioned, execution and speed to execute and improve operations and performance is where the focus needs to be, and that's where digital thread can add significant amount of value. We can no longer rely on the legacy siloed data if we want to scale and drive end-to-end performance that the industry expects to capitalize on the demand. The third thing is everyone in this industry and beyond the aerospace and defense industry talks about AI and advanced analytics, now. But AI without digital thread is just a high-powered engine without any fuel. To unlock true value from AI and machine intelligence, we must establish the seamless and trusted flow of data across design, production, operations, all the way into sustainment. So those are at least three reasons why we think digital thread is more important now than ever. With that said, I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Dr. Colleen Reike, who led this effort from EY. And she also has a team that was supporting her to develop this perspective that involved considerable amount of research, interviews, and data crunching as well. With that said, Colleen, I'm going to pass it on to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Raman. Appreciate it. And also want to echo the thank you to Tim and the AIA for the opportunity to support this research. And I'm really excited to bring these perspectives and share with everyone here today. So I do want to note, as Tim mentioned, that this presentation contains highlights from a more comprehensive report that is available on ey.com, and we will make sure that link is shared over for everyone in the chat to access. We're also more than happy to connect afterward if anyone would like to discuss anything further. So you can see our contact information here on the page, and we will bring this up again at the end of the presentation. So please feel free to reach out. So before we dive in, I also want to recognize the significant effort behind this work. As Raman mentioned, this perspective is the result of collaboration across an extensive team that covered research and analysis to synthesis and coordination. And I'm really grateful for the thoughtfulness and the rigor that went into bringing it all together. So with that context, let's move into the research methodology. Katie, if you can go to the next slide. All right, so before we dive into the findings, let me ground you in how we develop this perspective, because what you're about to hear is built on data and direct leadership experience. We combined a quantitative digital survey of over 50 A&D leaders from AIA member organizations with in-depth executive interviews. The digital survey captured perspectives across key dimensions, including digital thread awareness, adoption, challenges, business drivers, and value levers, while the interviews probe deeper into success stories, what leading organizations are doing differently to realize results, and practical examples that brought the data to life. Together, that gave us a broad ecosystem view across OEMs, suppliers, and even technology providers, and markets from commercial aviation to space. And importantly, the perspectives cut across seniority levels, from C-suite to practitioners. So what we're seeing is not theoretical. It's how digital thread is actually playing out in organizations today. So the goal here was simple. Understand not just where adoption stands, but why scaling stalls. and what leaders who break through do differently. So let's start with the headline: why this matters now, and why many organizations feel like they're close to value but not fully realizing it. Next slide, please. So before we jump in, just want to kind of orient you to the flow of what we will be walking through here. So each slide that you're going to see following or hear and following will follow the key themes in our reports. Essentially one theme for one slide there. On each of the slides, you're going to see circles sort of in the center there, and the numbers that you see reflect survey response percentages. And in the top right, we're showcasing examples of what one leader did differently that we will talk through. So before we jump in, I want to anchor on the definition of digital thread here, where, as Tim mentioned, this is indicating the thread of data connecting across the end-to-end life cycle from design to operations and operational. So if you step back, the promise of digital thread is clear. Connect data to drive better decisions at scale and create shared visibility and traceability across functions. And the survey data tells the industry believes in that promise. So nearly 9 in 10 respondents are familiar with digital thread. About 70% report implementation is underway at their organization, and a majority are already seeing better decisions and improved visibility. But here's the tension. Even with those signals, fewer organizations are realizing hard outcomes like measurable cost savings, as you can see on the right, and that's where the gap begins. Some of the leaders we spoke to approached this differently. They didn't try to transform everything at once. Rather, they targeted high friction workflows first, and they explicitly connected execution back to design quality and lifecycle outcomes. So in the example that you see in the top right, a leader focused on the gap between engineering and manufacturing, where manual data handoffs were driving errors. They introduced automated labor tracking and execution data flow, cutting manual entry, linking execution to design, and improving traceability and accuracy across the shop floor. Another leader targeted tooling and quoting workflows, where fragmented data slowed responsiveness. Digitizing those processes created immediate gains in cost control and speed. And in a more advanced case, a leader connected product configuration data end to end, enabling faster iteration and improved product performance. So in other words, they treated digital thread as a value delivery mechanism, not just a data initiative. Which leads to the natural question: if adoption is this widespread, why isn't that translating into enterprise level impact? Next slide, please, Katie. And this is where we see the disconnect. So despite strong early adoption, only about 1 in 7 organizations report true enterprise-wide implementation. The majority, over half, are still operating in pilots or limited deployments, even after multiple years of investment. And 3/4 still describe their maturity as early or developing. One leader we spoke with described having 6 to 10 parallel efforts across engineering, supply chain, and manufacturing, but limited integration between them, which capped enterprise impact. So their challenge wasn't capability, it was connecting these efforts into a single value stream. So the issue isn't starting, it's scaling. So what differentiated the leaders who broke through? They elevated digital thread to enterprise architecture. In the example that you see in the top right, one leader connected core systems, their PLM, ERP, MES, and supply chain, into a unified backbone, shifting from point solutions to a connected architecture. And critically, they created shared ownership across the business. The shift is from isolated pilots to integrated enterprise capability. And when we look deeper, we found the constraint isn't just technical, it's something more foundational. Next slide, please. So across the board, organizations are aligned on digital transformation, with roughly 2/3 reporting strong leadership support. But when you narrow to digital threads specifically, that clarity drops. Less than half have a defined strategy. So the gap isn't intent, it's ownership. In fact, the most consistent theme from the interviews was this: ownership, not technology, is the constraint. One leader noted that when digital thread initiatives were IT-led, they struggled to gain traction due to lack of direct linkage to business outcomes. Leaders who moved faster did three things differently. They put the business in charge of outcomes. They used IT as an enabler, not the driver, and tied digital thread directly to enterprise performance metrics. In the example seen on the page here, a cross-functional structure was introduced, with technical leads in each function aligned through a central team to ensure coordination across the value chain. And that's what creates discipline and ultimately scale. But even with the right ownership model, scaling requires something organizations often underestimate. Next slide, please. And that's fundamentally new ways of working. So the data highlighted three consistent constraints. Over half cite cultural change as the main barrier. Vendor solutions aren't seen as sufficient on their own, and capability depth remains moderate at best. So this isn't a tools problem. It's an operating model problem. Leaders who scaled successfully reframed the question. They stopped measuring tool adoption and instead tracked cycle time, quality, and decision speed. They aligned incentives to value streams, not systems. The leader noted in the top right of this page shared that mandated adoption and activity-based, what they dubbed vanity metrics, often masked cross-functional workflow breaks. They reframed adoption by focusing on reducing manual work. As teams started to see time saved and improved workflows, adoption accelerated organically. That shift from technology rollout to behavioral and operational change is what unlocks adoption. And underpinning all of this is another critical enabler, one that ultimately determines what can scale and what cannot. Next slide, please. At the core of digital thread is data, and this is where many organizations hit structural limits. So on one hand, expectations are high. So as you can see in the bottom right of the page, over 70% expect AI and advanced analytics to drive future value, and more than 80% see AI and ML machine learning as critical to realization. But the current state tells a different story. So as you can see in the center left, only about 30% say their data is standardized and accessible. Meanwhile, as you can see at the center of the page, data silos, interoperability issues, and weak governance are still widespread. So you have a mismatch. Ambition is outpacing data readiness. And that matters because AI is not the starting point here. It is a value multiplier that depends on a mature digital thread foundation. So what stood out from leading organizations? They didn't start with systems. They started with governance and definition of a single source of truth. They focused on enabling trusted data sharing across the ecosystem because that is what allows AI and advanced analytics to move beyond isolated experiments and operate consistently across functions and partners. The leader in the example on this page described how their teams were initially reluctant to share execution data due to concerns about misuse or loss of control. This fragmentation weakened lifecycle traceability and slowed decision-making. The leader addressed this by introducing governance frameworks that balanced access with accountability, which gradually built trust and increased participation. Another leader described pulling data from more than a dozen disconnected systems into manual spreadsheets, requiring significant effort just to get to a usable view. Their turning point was implementing a data integration layer that created a single source of truth, enabling real-time decision-making and AI-driven insights. Because ultimately, meaningful digital thread value can be achieved without AI, but AI only accelerates that impact when it is applied on top of trusted, governed data. Introduced too early, AI tends to increase rework and undermine confidence. Introduced on the right foundation, it becomes a true force multiplier. When that foundation is in place, the conversation shifts from capability building to value realization. So next slide, please. And this is where digital thread begins to translate into measurable business outcomes. According to the survey, we're seeing early value in areas like quality improvement and cycle time reduction, improved yield and traceability, and greater real-time supply chain visibility. And note that these percentages that you see on the page may seem low, but they represent the highest value use cases indicated by the respondents in the survey. And the survey also reinforces an important point about scale. The highest value use cases are inherently cross-functional. But adoption is still uneven, with most use cases not yet broadly scaled. So leaders who are ahead took a different approach. They built multi-year roadmaps tied to program lifecycle. They extended beyond internal operations to include suppliers and customers, and they focused on a portfolio of use cases tied to ROI, not experimentation. In the example on this page, the leader pointed to automation replacing manual data consolidation, which freed teams to focus on analysis and problem solving. Another leader shared that end-to-end traceability across components became a differentiator in a major proposal, helping secure a contract by demonstrating confidence at execution. Another example focused on tracking serialized parts across their lifecycle, which improved forecasting, maintenance decisions, and supply chain visibility. So they made the shift from capability deployment to performance delivery. So pulling all of this together, what does it take to move from insight to action? Next slide, please, Katie. So the findings ultimately converge on a clear set of actions. What's important is that these recommendations are not abstract best practices. They directly reflect the patterns we saw in both the survey and interviews about why many organizations stall in pilots while a smaller group begins to scale value. In other words, these are the moves that help close the gap between digital thread ambition and enterprise impact. So first, scaling requires clear ownership, a single accountable leader for outcomes. One of the clearest patterns in the research was that organizations with broad transformation intent often still lacked specific ownership for digital thread, which made it harder to align priorities and sustain momentum. The leaders making the most progress treated this as a business-led agenda with accountability anchored to enterprise performance rather than distributed across disconnected technology efforts. Second, funding has to shift from technology budgets to value streams. The report suggests many organizations still fund digital thread like a system implementation, which can reinforce siloed execution and make it difficult to scale beyond isolated pilots. The more effective approach was to invest around business problems and lifecycle outcomes, so the initiative is measured by the value it unlocks across functions, not whether a particular platform went live. Third, measurement changes from adoption metrics to workflow and productivity impact. The findings show that focusing only on tool rollout or user adoption can create the illusion of progress without proving enterprise value. The leaders who stood out were tracking improvements in cycle time, quality, visibility, and decision speed, because those are the signals that digital thread is actually changing how work is getting done. Fourth, organizations must standardize the data backbone before scaling AI. that recommendation comes directly from one of the biggest gaps in the research. Expectations for AI are high, but relatively few respondents describe their data as standardized, acceptable, and trusted across the enterprise. In practice, the organizations moving faster were the ones that invested first in governance, interoperability, and a shared source of truth, because AI cannot scale on fragmented data. And finally, leaders lean into and not avoid the cross-functional use cases where friction is the highest. The interviews consistently pointed to the biggest gains coming from places where handoffs break down between engineering and manufacturing, across supply chain visibility, or in tooling, quoting, and execution workflows. Rather than starting with the easiest use cases, leading organizations focused on these pressure points because that is where digital thread can most clearly reduce manual work, improve coordination, and demonstrate business value. So taken together, these moves redefine digital thread as an enterprise performance capability, not a technology platform. So there's one takeaway. So if there's one takeaway, the value is there, but it's unlocked by how you lead, not just what you deploy. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you listening. And now I will transition it back to Katie for some Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much, Colleen. As a reminder to everyone here, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. But just to kick us off, I have a question for Raman, and it's actually a two-part question. So most organizations understand the need for an operating model shift, but very few are actually making it stick. Where do you see those efforts breaking down? And what are the hardest trade-offs leadership teams have to make to get this right? Raman, you're still muted.
Yeah, thanks, Katie, for asking the question. So, I mean, this again, we see this time and again, right? Most of the aerospace and defense companies are legacy companies. I mean, I think I'm not saying that in a bad way. I mean, these companies have been around for a long time, and the products and the services that these companies make are safety critical, long life cycle. So there was a need for those companies to establish the functions in a certain way to meet the regulatory quality performance requirements and all of that. Having said that, now I think we have workflows that are essentially cross-functional. And most of the metrics that the companies have are all pretty much functional metrics oftentimes. And I'm an operations leader. I mean, I've got operational metrics. I'm a sales leader. I've got sales metrics, if you will. I'm an engineering person. I've got certain metrics, to deliver. But the metrics that we see, not in a lot of companies, the metrics are not cross-functional. We don't look at workflow level metrics. Ultimately, it comes down to the CEO, the COO. At that level, everything comes together. But organizationally, we are either seeing functionally deployed organizations, for example, or product-specific deployment. So I think that inherently the characteristics of what they do, do not lend themselves to have an operating model that is cross-functional. Having said that, some of the newer breed digital DNA-based companies that are challenging the status quo are leveraging these kinds of newer capabilities and structuring operating models from the get-go to be able to deliver faster, be more nimble, take advantage of data first, and so on. So I think that's what the legacy companies are trying to deploy. I mean, I think we're invigorated now more so, Katie, than in the past. The extent of operating model conversations we're having, essentially. Some of the companies going beyond functional silos to business units, and the businesses asking specifically, what's the value, of a going beyond function, if you will. What's the value of a corporate? For example, how do they corporate contributes more, to enhance the operating model to get the enterprise level outcomes beyond the functional outcomes.
Great. Thank you so much. We have another question in the chat from a participant who works at a metal finishing company who is the last stop in the supply chain before assembly. They work very hard on forecasting, but few of their customers give any data at all, including primes and OEMs. How can they make it clear A&D will struggle with ramping up in the coming years without dedicated ownership for supply chain top to bottom forecasting? I'll start with Tim on this question. Tim, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, it's a really, gosh, it's salient, right? It's an important topic that we've all been struggling with. And I think a couple of things. Number one, we AIA have been communicating back to our customer base the need for long-term funding and the ability to truly understand what their demand is. I think that as you think about a sub-tier having a challenge with forecast, what they're seeing is an impact of the prime being uncertain what their forecast is. It's not a matter in general of a prime trying to hold information back. They well recognize that, if I've got a long lead item, it's better for me to put that PO in as early as possible. But my constraint there is, do I know how much I need and when I need? And having a certainty from our customers around what their demand will be, I think is a crucial enabler to to getting that data into the supply chain. The other thing that I would note is that we so often recognize that there are these deep silos in information, and really digital thread is all about breaking down those silos and creating relationships between that data, being so very clear with your customers about the benefits of even preliminary forecast sharing and those types of things is an enabler, because it helps them to understand at a strategic level what the benefit to going a little bit out on a limb would be to creating forecast, delivering it to you, and then understanding that given this anticipated demand, I will then take my capital, I will build out a capability, I will reserve capacity in such a way that when you come in, you can actually consume it and consume it with some velocity.
Great.
Yep. Can I, Katie, I think this is, can I add
Please.
to what Tim was saying? But so I think completely agree with what Tim was saying. I think I hate to say acknowledge the problem. It exists. We all know it, and I think unfortunately we have not solved it. But I think that is part of the reason why the industry is struggling to deliver as well. And I presume that the question that's posed is coming from on the original equipment side. Now you throw in, if you had to do something on the aftermarket and MRO side, it's even more complicated. Now, on the production side, you could argue that there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to come up with a forecast, because the end units that are going to be produced are a given, essentially. We know that. So I think using the data thread of the bill of materials and the suppliers and the quantity per, we should be able to explode, barring some configuration changes on the mix, on the assembly line, we should be able to get to that level to provide a clear demand forecast at the tier 2, tier 3 level. But unfortunately, that has not happened. I think that's where things are broken down. So I think if the industry needs to scale and meet the demand, and particularly on next gen going forward, I think this needs to happen. I think the only positive thing I would say is there is more emphasis all the way from OEMs and tier ones now, more so than ever, to be able to provide more forecasting, because if they provide forecasting, then they can also get feedback from their suppliers on the risk. And then my request to the tier 2, tier 3s is essentially, when you do engage with your customers, perhaps as part of the conversation, capacity planning your investment for the next 5 years and so on. I think it's a right conversation to have, to ask for demand visibility or requirement visibility.
Speaking of broken systems, we just got a question about that. Corporations who are in different physical locations and permit each site to implement their own processes and procedures are creating broken systems. Broken systems using AI and tech to integrate more broken systems just accelerate the problem. So, has any company redesigned their business to achieve the outcome they desire before integrating technology? Colleen or Tim, I can
I
flip that
think
one to you.
Colleen has an
Yeah,
answer.
I can maybe start out and then would love to hear any build from Tim or Raman. Um I think we saw some examples of this in some of the interview conversations, and I think this dovetails into some of the recommendations around, bringing the governance and bringing the business goals first before we bring in the technology. And I think, being able to enable the technology to help rethink the workflows and the process is a key dimension of this. So the technology is not there just to automate or just enable the existing process and structure. It's there to help organizations rethink how they're finding value. So I don't know that I have necessarily like the perfect example in response to the question, but I do think we spoke to some leaders during the interviews that did see success in having that rethinking their workflows, rethinking their processes as the first step, and then thinking through where can AI, technology, et cetera, fold in. But Tim, please feel free to augment if you have
Yeah,
additional
I
thoughts or
think
Raman.
um, so. My history is out of the aerospace and defense industry, kind of as a practitioner. And I remember very early in my career, there was somebody who showed me a triangle and it had three different dimensions: cost, performance, and speed, right? And then in the middle, it said choose two. And there was this, I think, 20, 30 years ago, the assumption was that you could optimize for two out of the three, but not three. But my experience now is that the customers and competitors are very much looking at it and saying, we're going to do all three. And the only way that you get there is through integrative thinking, integrative people, integrative processes. And so when we think about, are companies wholesale abandoning everything that they've known in the past? Are they abandoning their legacy? No, they're not. But on the other hand, they do recognize that, if you're only focused on two out of the three performance characteristics, you don't get the bid. And so people are very strongly looking at, we need to take a look at every one of those things. We know we need to be more optimal in the way that we approach risk and complexity. And I think Raman brought up the topic of risk. I am passionate about understanding how we manage risk in the context of complexity. If I had unlimited amount of time, I would go and study those two topics and their relationship, but I don't. And I do think that those two topics are really defining who is going to be the most successful, understanding the triple mandate of you've got to be cost conscious, you've got to deliver it quickly, and it must have the performance that the customer demands. Raman, fascinated to hear your input.
No, I think I cannot agree more, Tim, what you said. I think this is precisely the reason why we see this pilot purgatory. I mean, Dr. Reich, he mentioned
Yep.
that lots of these digital thread projects, languishing in pilots. And because of that, if you just stick with a site, or a function and try to implement it, the data is not standardized, the process is not standardized, you cannot scale it beyond that particular pilot. The pilot could be successful, but then there's no enterprise value created. So, yes, that's precisely the issue. But having said that, I think, Tim, during this effort, we have been thrilled as an industry observer and practitioner that there are companies that are now looking at the entire workflows. So not just beyond just the functional silos. So whether it's order to cash or procure to play or plan to produce, there are companies that are looking at across sites and functions, and to be able to connect the data and then put digital enablement on top of it to drive outcome. I don't want to mention names here because it's a public forum, unfortunately, but I think I do, I want to say that I'm more so thrilled now than in the past that there are companies that are looking at holistic workflows and trying to inject, data, the data thread and digital enablement on the workflow beyond just putting it at a functional level. And that by definition requires the process to be standardized. If you're operating, and you might have seen the AI studies, Tim, that there's been publications that have come out recently. There was an investment bank that published a recent study, I think in March or so, said that 95, AI hasn't generated much value. This is not just A&D, broadly, any sector, companies have not been able to, realize value from AI and all that. There's a lot of truth to some of, these reports that are coming out, and that's because of what this the person is asking is trying to throw in technology and not focusing on standardizing processes, and working at the workflows holistically and not being siloed, right? So I think that's the unlock. Technology is not the unlock. I think process and people and standardization, that's the unlock going forward.
Yeah, and I'd love to riff again on this, and I'm just loving watching the chat proceed forward. There's a discussion in there on incentives, and that is a spot on, absolute must examine topic. And if I as an engineering leader am looking at my specific silo and saying I will optimize here, then that's what I'm going to do. And if my leadership is saying I am rewarding you for optimizing here, I'll go after that. If leadership is looking at it and saying, and this is where it gets complicated, because there are not unlimited funds, and there's not unlimited time, and there's not unlimited resources. But in as much as you can recognize what the friction points are, and Colleen highlighted a couple of kind of the interfunctional transitions, that's where you really get a lot of these friction points. And it's not just inside the organization, it's outside the organization. So if you're looking at incentives and saying, I want a faster system, go figure it out. That doesn't mean that you only get to optimize your silo. Go figure out the system. And when you measure people and reward people for that behavior, you have a much better chance, no guarantee, but a much better chance of getting after what your customer is really looking for.
And I think one quick thing to build on that too, Tim, speaking to kind of, some of the examples that we heard in the interviews around the organic growth. So even without monetary incentives, mandates, things like that, a lot of the leaders that we spoke to demonstrated organic acceleration as cross-functional teams start to see the value, they start to see the time reduction, they start to see how the collaboration is improving, they feel heard, that makes a big difference as well. So sometimes the incentives might be the initial catalyst, but that organic growth is definitely a major driver from what we saw in this research.
This is a great discussion. I'll jump in with one more question, comparing digital thread adoption to early adoption of the internet. If digital thread scaling evolves in the same way, what prioritized industry precursors must be established before widespread adoption can occur across the supply chain, MROs, OEMs, etc.? Anyone who wants it, I'm happy to.
Yeah, I think I'll take it, and I think maybe it's going to be non-technical, but I this is like Tim mentioned earlier, right? This is a very, very data-rich industry, and we are collecting the data today. I mean, it's there. It's just being siloed. We've got product related data. I mean, all the engineering teams have developed this during the course of conceptual design, preliminary design, detailed design, and then finalizing the bill of material. There is all the product related data. There is the operational data that the operators have, and a lot of it's getting to the OEMs and the sometimes even the tier ones as well. Environmental data where the assets are operating is also being captured. How the equipment is operated is being captured. So I'm I don't know if there is like a precursor. I mean, I think we have the ingredients already. I mean, that the data is there. I think how we are structured and organized, from a company. I think Colleen mentioned about operating model at companies, how we are incentivizing or not incentivizing, essentially to look at it at the enterprise level. I think that to me is the issue. I think the precursors are there already. I don't know, Tim, Colleen, please jump in if you have a different view.
No, I don't have a different view. I do think it's interesting to look at the history of software development. It used to be that you would go through that waterfall process and you define requirements up front, and then hopefully on the very back end, software would pop out. And we recognize that that is not a great way to do it for a multitude of reasons. One of the fixes, in addition to more agile processes, was the addition of different types of teams, and in particular software development teams that have somebody who is expert in database design, someone who is expert in user interface, someone who is expert in data transfer, all of those things. We are bringing cross-functional teams together, integrated product teams. And I think that those structures can help us to recognize what the opportunities are with respect to digital thread. And by the way, I would extend those IPTs not just inside a given enterprise, but I would say, what does an IPT across the supply chain look like, right? Let's really bring people together and talk about the roadblocks. One of the things that I thought was so fascinating as I was out doing research earlier in my career that I was able to publish on was looking at when you bring buyer and supplier together, you have demonstrated performance improvement writ large. It works that way. And it's only because you put the right people in the right rooms having the right conversations. And it is in many ways that simple. There's not a lot of magic to it other than, do you have the right people coming together and having those conversations? And that to me is one of the enablers. As soon as you get people in that room and they start saying, oh, now I understand why you do what you do, and the other side is saying the same, you can make massive breakthroughs. And I know that we do a lot of coordination throughout the supply chain. We need to have more unstructured conversations, is my take.
Yeah, I think if I can loosely flip the question, I think the precursors, I think maybe it's a less so precursors are there. I would say, the five things that Colleen showed earlier as the imperatives going forward. So for the adoption to happen and scale to realize enterprise value, I think the five things that Colleen showed, which is, to me, I think that's probably what is required, beyond, if I can flip the precursor to what is required, a single enterprise owner focused on outcomes, look at the value streams and not by technology solution. I think looking at the metrics need to focus on workflow and productivity, and then of course the data backbone, and then the operating model as well. So I don't know, Colleen, if you want to elaborate, but I think I just wanted to me, these are the five things that would help unlock.
I have another question for Colleen, just kind of about where we've been and where we're going. Many organizations are trying to innovate while still carrying significant technical debt and legacy systems. From what you're seeing, how should leaders think about balancing the need to modernize what they have with the pressure to invest in what comes next?
Yeah, that's a great question, Katie. And this is something that we heard, I think, in most of our discussions and was also a part of the survey as well, because that's something many industries, and particularly aerospace, are kind of grappling with is, legacy systems, legacy data, et cetera. And I thought one particularly compelling example that we heard from one leader was sort of describing approaching this as a layer cake using their words where instead of waiting to replace legacy transactional systems, they actually created a data layer above them to help enable connection and interoperability between new systems and whatever their legacy systems were. And I think the insight was really that the modernization no longer means having to upgrade everything at once, which I think can often be the perspective or the perception. But by establishing a connective data fabric first, they were able to work around that technical debt, prioritize the systems that mattered most, and create a practical path to innovation without disrupting the broader innovation. And I think what it sounded like made that this particularly successful for this leader was the sequencing. So connecting and tying the data and the governance together first, then building the analytics and the intelligence on top of that. So I think, the broader message is that leaders can generate meaningful progress even in complex legacy environments by layering new capabilities into the existing landscape rather than treating the full system replacement as a prerequisite to innovate.
Thanks, Colleen. I'll take one more question from the audience. Someone asked about getting government published data using standardized data formats that can quantify performance and cost RAO across every industry. Is that something you can speak to, Tim?
Yeah, and understand that the government is well familiar and deeply incented to pick up data, use data, be data driven. Every time I talk to my government friends, they are focused on what data can we get? How do we relate it? And how do we ensure that the data that we have is the same data that you have? There is some complexity to it because uh, everybody has some secret sauce that they use to deliver. And my intellectual property as a company is important to me being able to gain a shareholder return for the investment that I'm making. So I think that everyone is recognizing that data is certainly one of the sources of value out there. Government is looking at it and saying, how do we leverage the data while providing opportunity and incentive to invest? And companies are looking at it and saying, if I can provide the right data to the government, then I can provide them a level of assurance. And that can help them to manage their risk as well. And that's a good thing from the perspective of a supplier or a prime contractor to the government. We all recognize that data sharing is a mandate. And I will tell you, I have more conversations right here, right now about how do we do that effectively and protect individual accountability, individual intellectual property, individual incentives to be able to make that work effectively. We're still working on it. We really are. But I would say we're very much focused on it. It's not something that we think about occasionally. It's an everyday conversation in my world.
Well, as we start to wrap up, I have one last question, and I'd love to hear from all three of our panelists on this. It's a very simple, easy question. Where do we go from here? What's next? Colleen, I'll start with you.
So I think my answer to that is almost pretty simple in just recognizing and wrapping our heads around the problem, I think is the logical first step. And I think that's also a microcosm of the broader, digital thread, technology, et cetera. Let's fully understand the problem. Let's collaborate. Let's understand what's going to drive value before we start to, find solutions. We don't need to, even if we have a hammer, We don't want to just be a hammer in search of a nail. So I think, from at least from my perspective, this research, the recommendations, some of the insights that we found, socializing those across different functions, across different stakeholders, organizations, and recognizing that this is an ecosystem problem, we're collectively going to need to collaborate on a solution, I think is the first step in terms of next steps.
We'll go to Raman next.
Yeah, Katie, I think in the interest of time, I'll try to be brief, but I think I'm super excited and passionate about this thing because our fleet in the commercial side is growing. Number one. Number two, the fleet is also aging as well, average age. Hopefully that'll change. Number three is we've got fleet operating in more harsher, newer environments that we have not had in the past as well. So, and then on top of that, in the next few years, we're going to have a next gen new aircraft announcement that has to come on, design has to start. Simultaneously, we've got defense ramp up both in Europe as well as here. We've got a confluence of things that are happening, to this sector. And so to me, I think it's the imperative is more now, here and now. So I think, like Colleen said, I think share the pitfalls as to why it has not scaled so far. And then I think the study aimed to uncover that. So my only request to it is focus on why it has not scaled. And then the 4 or 5 things that Colleen highlighted, I think share that. Some of it individuals will have control over. Some of it you wouldn't have control, but at least your leadership in the companies would have control over. And if AIA can help evangelize this, and Colleen and EY can help, absolutely. But I think we're more focused on the industry, help them achieve the outcome the industry is capable of, but being stifled by these challenges. Tim?
Yeah, I love going back to that slide 5. I think as well, read the entire report because it is so insightful. There's so much more in the report that we just haven't been able to cover today. Colleen did a great job of hitting the high points. And then look at those 5 topics. The last thing I would leave people with is the fact that this is it is not it's not a technology problem. It's a people problem. And recognizing that we want to incent, that we want to recognize the people who are making these things happen, I think that will drive you forward in your adoption. Raman began with the comments around why is right here, right now different. It's a great framing, but the time is different. This is a mandate. We do need to go faster. We do need to do better. And now is the time to go and grab it, grab the right people, put them in the right rooms, examine why things are not working, read the whole report. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity to be successful in those steps.
Thank you so much, Tim, and thank you to all 3 of our panelists today. We had a great discussion, and again, the recording of this will be on the AIA website probably by the end of the day. So,
Thank you, Katie. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Colleen.
thank you.
Thank you, everyone.